Yeah, hello. Welcome to the fourth installment of the ground check discussions organized by the German Archaeological Institute. Last week, we learned about ancient and modern cultures who had to cope with water scarcity. Today, we will shift gear in two dimensions. Firstly, we will discuss the consequences not of a lack, but of a surplus of water. And we will focus on the present day and the near future. We've seen recently in the news how floods devastated villages in Italy, in France. In September, there was continuous rainfall in Sudan, swelling the Blue Nile, so it destroyed 60,000 homes. That was a catastrophe for the people there, but it also endangered the pyramids of Merove, a World Heritage Site of the UNESCO. And this is the theme of our fifth discussion. It's titled Impact of Climate Change on Cultural Heritage, Coastal Risk and Flooding. Already today, sea level rise, erosion, salt spray, they are a threat to Scottish castles, to temples in the Mediterranean, as well as for the Moai, the giant statues on the Easter Island. So what can climate models tell us about the future of these important archaeological sites? How can we protect them? Or do we have to stand by and watch as they disappear into the sea? We will again start off with 4 presentations by our experts. Then we have discussion within the speakers on the panel. And finally, we will pick up the question of the audience. And I want to encourage you to type in your questions right away, either using the chat function with Zoom or using Facebook or Twitter. And we will try to bring these questions in at a time appropriate. So to our speakers, our panel today, there's first David Harkin. He's a climate change scientist at Historic Environment Scotland. This is a foundation in charge of more than 300 castles and sites, many of them at the coast and so at risk. Professor Burkhard Vogt joins us from Bonn. He's a specialist for the archaeology of the Middle East at the German Archaeological Institute, and now he works on several islands in the Pacific. The geographer Lena Reimann is a member of the research group Coastal Risks and Sea Level Rise at the Kiel University. And last but not least, the engineer and physical geographer, Professor Nassos Vafeidis, is the head of this research group at Kiel University. Welcome to all of you. But first, we want to go to Scotland. The castles there are imposing structures as they have endured many centuries. However, they have to face new challenges. The rainfall has increased by 20% since the 1960s in Scotland. I wouldn't have deemed this possible, but actually it seems to happen. And many of these heritage sites are right at the coastline. So do you see already consequences of climate change at the sites of Historic Environment Scotland, David Harkin?
Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for that introduction. So I'll hopefully answer some of those questions as I go through just a couple of slides with you. So I'm sharing my screen now, and there we go. So yes, my name is David Harkin. I'm the climate change scientist at Historic Environment Scotland, and my role is all about trying to understand what the impacts of climate change are on the properties that we look after. So Historic Environment Scotland, we are the lead public body for Scotland's historic environment. Our mission is to protect, conserve and manage the historic environment for the enjoyment, enrichment and benefit of everyone. And we have quite a few different roles to play. So we are the sort of authority on designations and consents in Scotland. We provide grants and other funding to repair and revitalise the historic environment. We also do a lot of research and provide advice and guidance on how to look after the historic environment, as well as lots of training and learning opportunities as well for people around Scotland. The part of the organisation that's most closely related to what I do is in the direct care of over 300 monuments of international significance. So that ranges from places like Edinburgh Castle, I'm sure that you'll be familiar with that, all the way through to a range of different sites of all shapes and sizes right across the organisation. And we don't need to dwell on this any longer than a slide or two. But why do we do what we do? And we do what we do because the climate is changing. So Historic Environment Scotland has a very active programme of climate change work, of climate change research, and has done now for about 10 years. And we have done that because we know the climate is changing, and we can already see and observe changes in the climate that are having an impact on the places that we look after. So many of you will have seen the climate stripes diagram, I'm sure. I love it. It's just a really simple and visual way of communicating that the climate is changing. So the graph in front of you, each stripe represents a year, starting in 1884 all the way up to 2020 or 2019. And the stripe is coloured based on how it deviated from the average sort of temperature for the 20th century. So the warmer stripes indicate years that were warm, the cooler stripes indicate years that were cooler. And as you can see there, the 5 warmest years in the UK have now all occurred since 2006. So we know the climate's changing. But what I really want to talk about is what is the role of cultural heritage in this world where the climate is changing. And one point to make really quickly is that we can learn a lot from the past. So this picture here that you're looking at, this is a village in the northeast of Scotland, and you might notice that all the houses are aligned in a particular fashion. That's because those people built their houses with the gable end facing out to the sea, because the gable end is the strongest part of the building. So that protects it from the incoming storms and sort of nasty weather that we get in Scotland. So there's little bits and pieces that we can pick up from the way our towns and cities and villages have developed and the way our culture's developed as well. So I think that's quite a nice point. But what I really want to talk about is building on from that sort of understanding, is building on from what we can learn from our cultural heritage in this world of climate action. But really, actually, the purpose of today is to talk about the threat to cultural heritage from climate change. So the picture you're looking at here is one of the properties in care that we look after. It's Links of Notland. It's in Orkney. You'll see in the sort of bottom left corner, there's a sort of excavated area. So the site is a really important Neolithic farming settlement. So it's over 5,000 years old. And actually also in the same area, you find Orkney's largest Bronze Age settlement as well. So in terms of archaeology, this is a rich, rich landscape. Around about 10 years ago or so, something changed in the coastal dynamics of that particular part of the islands, and the dune system that had been protecting the site for many, many thousands of years started to break down. So the site was becoming exposed, the archaeology was vulnerable and being lost. So Historic Scotland, alongside other partners, have undertaken a series of emergency excavations at the site. I just wanted to throw this in because it's a really cool image. This is Links of Notland. Our digital documentation team went up and scanned the site, and it really brings out the detail of the site once you start to excavate it. So if these slides are getting shared, I would recommend you sort of look through this and sort of zoom in, and you can pick out lots of detail that you actually miss in the aerial photographs. But the point I want to make is that it's just as well we went up there to excavate the site, because the site has given us some incredible archaeological finds. So the figurine you see on the right hand side there, that is the earliest representation of the human form ever found in the UK, and we found that at Links of Notland. The item on the left is a carved bone pin, and I'm a bit biased, but I happen to think it's a more important find because I found it. So I got to go up and sort of do a little bit of training as a sort of temporary archaeologist for a week, and on day one of excavation, I found that bone pin. And all of a sudden, I had this link to the past that I've never had before. So I was touching this object that people hadn't seen or touched in over 5,000 years. So it was a really close connection to the past that you don't quite get if you're visiting maybe a museum or walking around the site. So it was quite special. But the point around this is that through the impacts of climate change, through the impacts of the loss of cultural heritage, there's actually unique opportunities for people to engage with their culture in a way that they haven't done so, in a way that wouldn't have otherwise been possible. So actually, although climate change is this sort of existential threat, and we have to do everything we can to reduce the impact of it, through this process of loss and through understanding sites in a different way, there is actually opportunities for people to get involved with these sort of cultural heritage sites that they wouldn't have got to do otherwise. So there's a really important role for cultural heritage in there to inspire climate action. Because if you can demonstrate and show the threat of something that people love and the something people cherish, then through that you can potentially bring some people along on a journey to take action of climate change. So I won't go any further than that. That was just a really quick introduction, and I'm really looking forward to the end of the discussion that comes later on, where I'm sure we'll pick up on some of these points in more detail.
Thank you, David. So now we've looked at Scotland. The effects of climate change are probably quite different in the middle of the Pacific. There are the famous Moai sculptures on Rapa Nui, the Easter Island, and they happen to be right at the coast, most of them. So can they withstand climate change in the long run, Professor Burkhard Vogt?
I want to introduce you to the impact of climate change on the cultural heritage in the Pacific and especially on Easter Island. Climate change is, among others, manifested by global warming and by rising sea levels and coastal flooding. At present, the average global rise is 3 millimeters. Since the year 1900, sea level has risen to about 200 millimeters. It is also an up-to-date phenomenon in the Pacific. The total and irretrievable disappearance of minimum 8 low islands in the Western Pacific has been publicized by the international media. What you can see here on this map, and especially the central part of the map, which depicts the Pacific, is it's not only a rise in sea level, it's also, we also record falling sea levels here in front of the Central American coast of the Pacific. The site that I will show you in a few moments is Rapa Nui, or Easter Island, which is in the southern part of the Pacific. But here you get an idea how irregular the sea level trends are. These are only the figures from 1993 to 2012. Among the sites I want to mention are especially the Marshall Islands and also Kiribati, or Kiribati as we know it, where the populations have started to abandon the islands. Especially the atolls are submerged, as you can see on the left top. This is one of these atolls in Polynesia. Coastal housing and archaeological sites, such as this temple platform on Bora Bora, or this coastal site on Easter Island, are increasingly destroyed by heavy storms, the surf, and the force of tsunami, which is particularly true for this monument here on Easter Island. The same is true, although to a lower extent, for the elevated or even mountainous islands, where modern and ancient development is concentrated mostly along the island's littorals, such as in the central and eastern Pacific. Climate change and environmental change have been a major concern since the colonization of these islands in the Pacific. Frequently, change is hardly perceptible, otherwise even deliberate, for example, when complete non-endemic landscapes have voluntarily been introduced into a new environment. Rapa Nui, or Easter Island, is one of these mountainous islands. Before it was colonized, it was covered by a vegetation of almost 20 million palm trees. Within a short time, the palm forests were cut down and slash and burn were practiced by the settlers. The effects became quickly noticeable. Erosion degraded fertile soils and exposed rocky surfaces. Even today, sediments are washed into the sea, blanketing and thus choking the few coral reefs that surround the island that you can see here at the bottom. And after a heavy rainfall, it looks like this here, top right. You see the red color of sediment just in front of the coastline. In terms of archaeology, Rapa Nui is a very special case. Until now, almost 30,000 archaeological sites and monuments have been recorded on the island. Most of these situated along the coast. Among these are the famous giant tuff statues that you have seen at the beginning, the moai, and also their platforms, the ahu. Coastal cliffs are weakened by the surf. The salt spray intensifies the surface weathering of the giant tuff statues. These challenges, however, had existed before or since the very beginning, but are presently increased by human intervention. Rising sea level, however, sea levels are a minor, although a slow-growing problem, although the very fast weathering of the moai is indeed the main problem today. So the weathering of the moai by salt spray. How did ancient indigenous populations counteract the effects of environmental change? The construction of terraces, such as on Hawaii, top left, the spreading of stone mulching on Rapa Nui, this is what you see here on the top right, stone mulching. The raising of artificial habitation platforms in the sea here, on the Solomon Islands in the West Pacific, and the reinforcement of coastal embankments on the Society Islands here, Raiatea, are some of several measures taken to minimize the effects of environmental change. And this they accomplished with great success, which, however, may not suffice nowadays requirements. The last two illustrations I want to show are from an ongoing modern intervention on Rapa Nui that has been implemented by the local Rapa Nui organization Mauinua for the safeguard of the temple platform of Ahu Ura Uranga Te Mahina that you see here on top. A ritual platform with giant statues on the southeast coast of Easter Island, which has already been gnawed on by the surf. Local authorities are presently reinforcing the seaside of the monument. I don't have a photo of that, but I show you a similar one from another site on the same coast further to the east. This is a similar measure that has been taken previously to strengthen another ritual platform on the coast. And this is more or less all this is modern here to protect the cliff against the surf. So this is what I show you for the moment, and I'm waiting for your questions later.
Thank you, Professor Vogt. These were now two examples of threats to historic sites and possible adaptations even to climate change in this last example. Now we want to zoom out and look at the bigger picture. At the University of Kiel, researchers combine erosion and flooding simulations with geodata of World Heritage sites in the Mediterranean, and they have the big view. So, Lena, Reimann, where will sea level rise in the Mediterranean have the biggest impact?
Thank you very much. Great. So yeah, in this talk, I will give you a brief summary of a study that was published in the year 2018, in which we did a regional scale assessment of UNESCO World Heritage at risk from sea level rise related hazards. And we did this in the entire Mediterranean region. The starting point of this work was actually that coastal impact assessments at regional to global scale usually account for population exposure to sea level rise, but they do not account for heritage that is located in exposed locations. I guess that everyone who's here agrees that heritage is highly vulnerable to sea level rise related impacts. And in this study, we particularly concentrated on UNESCO World Heritage. And this is because it has a high intangible value. That means it's very difficult to actually assess or quantify the damages caused by sea level rise. It may lose its outstanding universal value, which qualifies it for being inscribed in the World Heritage List due to the impacts of sea level rise, and it also has special adaptation needs. So typical or traditional adaptation strategies may not be applicable to UNESCO heritage or heritage in general. I will quickly walk you through the steps that we took to do this assessment. And for this assessment, we use the risk framework of the IPCC, where risk results from the interaction of a hazard, exposure to this hazard, and vulnerability of the exposed elements. And in this assessment, we concentrated on the interaction between hazards, so in this case, sea level rise, and exposure, in this case, UNESCO heritage, to define risk. The first step was to assemble a World Heritage database that has the spatial representations of each of the World Heritage sites in the database. And this is what you can see here. So this map gives an overview of the database. We found 49 World Heritage sites located in low-lying coastal areas in the Mediterranean region, and we digitized those. And then in the second step, we modeled the 100-year floodplain based on the 100-year storm surge plus the amount of sea level rise based on 4 different sea level rise scenarios until the year 2100. And what you can also see here in this map is the extreme sea levels under the highest sea level rise scenario that we used. And what you can see is that we have the highest extreme sea levels, so the highest storm surges in the Northern Adriatic Sea and in the Gulf of Gabes. The third step was then to combine these information, to combine the floodplain information and also the heritage sites to estimate the flood extent and flood depth for each heritage site in each time step. For each scenario, and we also estimated erosion risk to sea level rise based on the characteristics of the coastline where the World Heritage Site is located, and also based on the distance of the World Heritage Site from the coast. And based on this, we then calculated a risk index both for flooding and erosion, and this index could then range from 0, not at risk, to 10, at very high risk. Let me show you some of the results. So here you can see flood risk in the year 2100 under the high end sea level rise scenario. And you can see a clear concentration of the highest flood risk in the Northern Adriatic Sea. And this is because of the high extreme sea levels that we can see in this area. In total, we found 40 World Heritage sites to be at risk until 2100 under the high-end sea level rise scenario, and the highest number in Italy, Croatia, and Greece. This looks pretty different for erosion risk, actually, and we have a much more spread picture across the entire Mediterranean region. And this is because erosion risk is much more depending on the local characteristics that are at the site. And yeah, we have moderate to high risk at a high number of sites. And in total, it was 46 out of the 49 sites that are potentially at risk until 2100 from erosion. And also highest number in Italy, Croatia, and Greece. The key messages that I would like to give is that in the Mediterranean alone, we found more than 40 World Heritage sites that are likely to be at risk from sea level rise related flooding and erosion by the year 2100. And this regional scale assessment can be particularly used to raise awareness by identifying World Heritage sites that are most at risk, by actually being able to rank sites and see which sites we may want to focus on or we may want to prioritize in the short to medium term. What this regional scale assessment cannot do is tell us what specific adaptation strategies we need for specific World Heritage sites, because these have to be developed based on local scale assessments that include the peculiarities of each of the World Heritage sites. One positive note that I would like to end with is one suitable adaptation strategy, or I guess we can discuss about whether this is a good example, but it's the only example in the Mediterranean region where we have an adaptation strategy that is supposed to protect an entire World Heritage site, and it's the MOSE project. Many of you might have heard about it. So there are mobile barriers that are installed in the 3 inlets to the Venice Lagoon, and these can be raised during high water conditions. And the reason why I'm showing this is that roughly 2 weeks ago, or not even 2 weeks ago, these barriers have actually been raised for the first time under high water conditions. And it was a very successful thing, because there has been a lot of controversy about this project. And Venice kept dry, or stayed dry during that time. And yeah, it was considered a big success. That's so far it from my side, and thanks for your attention.
Thank you, Lena Reimann. I've got already a question from the audience. There's a question about what are these risk factors 1 to 9 mean? Do you have any qualitative interpretation so that we can have a feeling? What does 9 mean? Is it completely gone to the sea, or what does it mean?
Yeah, thanks for this question. I didn't want to go too much into detail about the risk indices that we produce, but here is a slide actually based on this. So we have, so for flood risk, for example, we have the flood area, so the percentage of the site flooded, and the flood depth. So as soon as at least 50% of the site would be flooded from this 100-year storm surge, and at least and the flood depth would be at least 1 meter, then we would have a very high risk. This is now only 5, because we are then just adding up the flood depth and the flood area index, and then it results in a 10 maximum if it's at least 50% and at least 1 meter.
Okay, thank you for this clarification. Now we know there are sites where we have to act fast, but to do this, we need strategies. You already referred to one, the Moses project. So the heritage sites can't move away from the rising sea level. What other options are on the table, Professor Nassos, Vafeidis?
Yes, thank you very much. I'm sharing my screen, which I hope you can see. And I will thank you very much for the invitation, first of all, and also for the initiative. I think these initiatives are very important for mobilizing the community to look into solutions. I will follow up on Lena. I also have 2 kind of overlaps in my presentation, and I will talk about sea level rise, which is, I must note, only one of the pressures that climate change exerts, but also beyond climate change, there are many others that are exacerbated by climate change. Now it's working. So I wanted, first of all, to clarify how much sea level rise we're talking about, because this can often be an issue of discussion. And this graph includes all our current knowledge, on our best knowledge, let's say, on sea level rise. 2 things I want to emphasize: the small graph embedded in the larger one, which shows what may be happening until 2100. And to summarize this in a few words, we're looking at well over 0.5 meter of sea level rise by the end of the century. How much exactly depends on the mitigation, on the emissions. But many experts agree that we're likely to see about 1 meter of sea level rise if we continue as we're doing currently. One also very important thing that sometimes escapes us because of the time horizon is that over hundreds of years or centuries, sea level can rise up to several meters, even if we stop emitting. There is a thermal lag, delay in the response of the ocean to warming, and we might be seeing, or we will be seeing, much higher sea level rise than what we will be seeing in the next decades, even if we mitigate strongly. Sea level rise is going to have several impacts, of course, mostly flooding, intensity of flooding, so more intense flooding, but also more frequent, and eventually submergence. But it's not like a bathtub where, you know, water is rising slowly and finally we're up to the knee. We will experience this by flooding more often. We will see more erosion, as the previous speakers also suggested, saltwater intrusion, salt spraying, but also changes in wetlands. So changes in the coastal, substantial changes in the coastal environment. The impacts can be devastating if we do nothing, like the no response option, but usually we do. I mean, people do not stay there and get wet. So they either protect via dikes or beach nourishment. They retreat if things get bad, or plan sometimes, and they accommodate. They raise their buildings, or they take up insurance or private measures for their home. And in recent years, we're also advancing. I mean, you can see that in the Maldives. We're going towards the sea, we're putting grounds, we're raising the ground and going towards the sea. But we're also kind of rediscovering the importance of nature-based solutions, so dunes or wetlands. And these are important things to keep in mind for the next discussion. Now, what happens with heritage sites? The story is a little bit different, although they tend to suffer from similar impacts like flooding. Now we will have more intense flooding. So, you know, for example, higher water speed during the flooding, more frequent flooding, submergence in some cases, faster erosion, salt intrusion, the salt spray that we heard before, but also compound flooding, events happening at the same time and exaggerating or exacerbating the impacts of single events. So, for example, coastal flooding combined with pluvial flooding, as we saw a few days ago or a few weeks ago in the Mediterranean. There are more than 200 coastal UNESCO World Heritage Sites which can be highly vulnerable. I have this this graph from the Heritage on the Edge. I was very surprised actually to see Google Arts and Culture having such a nice website on World Heritage about 5 sites. And the risk is that they eventually, besides being destroyed, they can also lose their outstanding universal value, which is what characterizes them as World Heritage. The problem is the common adaptation options that we are using for protecting coastal areas do not necessarily apply, cannot be implemented in the case of World Heritage. So relocation is something actually that has taken place for cultural heritage, but we need to remember that a World Heritage Site is its outstanding universal value is intrinsically linked to its location. We have accommodation. It's difficult to accommodate. It's not possible to take insurance, for example, and we cannot protect them because we might destroy aesthetically what we're actually trying to protect. So we have several limitations when trying to adapt, and typical adaptation measures are not suitable, and we do need innovative adaptation strategies, and I will also show what Lena showed. So the MOSE project, which is a completely new project that the world is looking at as an experiment. It's a solution which is not, you know, an out-of-the-box solution, something completely new, and we see that it has taken more than 15 years, several unexpected problems, and I'm happy to discuss this further if people would like to. But eventually it's been completed much later than expected, than anticipated, and it's a new solution, and we're all eager to see how it's going to work. And so far it seems to be doing a good job. There are barriers, there are issues that prevent us from adapting, generally in coastal areas. And we had this study a few years ago, and we identified some major barriers, which, however, are essentially different for World Heritage. So, for example, we have institutional barriers, overlapping responsibilities of agencies, unclear regulations, not sure who is responsible for what, which delays or sometimes impedes adaptation. And this is also expected to be the case in for World Heritage, because we don't have a clear, in most places at least, a clear framework of how we should respond to sea level rise, but climate change as well. Social conflict, which is a major issue in coastal adaptation due to the redistribution of costs and benefits. I would expect this not to be a major issue when it comes to World Heritage because of, I don't know, the pride that people feel and the sense of identity that they have with World Heritage. So I would expect this to be much less of a barrier. Mobilizing finance, which is a major problem with coastal adaptation, seems not to be such a big problem with World Heritage, at least what we saw from Notre Dame some years ago, where finance was very quickly mobilized and collected in the form of donations mostly for its restoration. Of course, a different problem, but it shows that people respond quickly to the loss of World Heritage. However, economic barriers in the sense of costs and benefits are possibly difficult to assess. How much can we invest to save our World Heritage when we cannot really quantify its value? I mean, economists are very quick in giving values to many things, but they do not usually dare to give values to World Heritage. And technological limits, which we normally don't have. So basically, if you speak to an engineer, like my old profession, let's say, they can build everything. Nothing is a problem. However, when it comes to World Heritage, we cannot use the common solutions that we normally implement, and we need to find new ideas, things that have not been implemented before. However, at the same time, we can see that adaptation to World Heritage can introduce new solutions in general for adapting to sea level rise, and World Heritage sites can be pioneering research or even practice for adapting to sea level rise. I will close here with some messages, mainly wanting to stress the need for innovation and also interdisciplinarity. I didn't have very much time in the talk, but an engineer cannot solve this problem on their own. An archaeologist cannot solve these problems on their own. We need groups of people that can actually learn to work together. We need chemists, we need architects, for example, to come up with innovative solutions. So we need groups, teams of many specialties that can actually address these issues. Thank you very much. And I'm sorry, it's a bit jumpy, my keypad. And I will be happy to answer any questions if there are any during the discussion.
Yeah, thank you. These were all interesting presentations we heard. We will discuss them now on the panel, but I would like to remind the audience that you already can ask questions using Zoom chat, Facebook, or Twitter, and we will come back to them later on. But first, I would like to go to the specific sites of Rapa Nui and Scotland to hear how's the situation today. It's already too late, so are castles already crumbling in the Scottish Sea? Are the moai already toppling over? How bad is the situation right now?
Well, obviously from a Scottish perspective, I think when we're thinking about things like sea level rise and coastal erosion, it's really important to remember that these processes have always happened. So there has always been the sort of gradual loss of soft coastline, or the redistribution of sediment, etc. So this process has always happened, but of course climate change speeds up that process. So you can go to some parts of Scotland and you can walk around vulnerable parts of the coastline, and you can actually see a sort of archaeological deposits eroding out onto the beach in front of you. So it's a very, very visible, tangible thing that you can see, of course, but not a new thing, but you can absolutely see it. And there's been lots of work done in Scotland through various partners. So there's a project called Dynamic Coast, for example, and they've assessed all of Scotland's soft coastline and determined that actually the rates of erosion have doubled since the 1970s. So it's a very real problem. It's very present, and I guess to answer the other part, no, it's not too late to do something about it, I would say.
Professor Vogt?
Yeah, on Easter Island, the situation is a bit difficult because, first of all, it's never too late to do something. But the problem is that not everybody will agree to it. Yeah, because I mean, if you want to take measures to protect the sites, you have to intervene. And the fact that you intervene is not welcomed by parts of the population, because what they say is that these are the sites of the ancestors. They don't want to move things. They don't want to move the statues, because once the statues are moved, they are going to lose their importance. And at least part of the population is willing, or is ready, let's put it that way, to sacrifice these objects. If they are lost within 1, 2, 3 generations, they will accept that. So that makes it difficult. From the technical point of view, of course, it is possible to intervene, but as long as they cannot agree on a procedure, it will certainly not happen. It is necessary to do something, but we suggest something different, at least for a transitional period, at least to study these monuments, to document these monuments, and of course also to excavate these monuments, because some of them will be lost. And we have also to accept that we will not be able to save all of them. This will simply not be possible.
So what do the other members of the audience think about this approach, documentation first? So we document what we have, and this is a most important step to go forward. Yeah.
Yes, I think this is a very important point. I only have experience in World Heritage, a bit less experience in cultural heritage, for example. However, I find it very interesting that in all the work that we've been doing, we do not have information. I mean, we need to develop the information, the data ourselves, and there is no like unified database that can be directly used by scientists for the global world heritage. And I see definitely a role for UNESCO there that needs to pick up on this. And of course, direct funding within UNESCO, I mean, to organize initiatives like that. I've been working with World Heritage data for a while now, and we published some years ago the study with Lena, the study that Lena led. And one of the main problems was the lack of data. And this was a study that had begun long time ago, and it didn't happen 10 years earlier because of the lack of data, because it's very difficult to put these data together. So documenting, writing things, so having records of what every site involves, characteristics, would be, in my opinion, invaluable. It would be a great tool for researchers to pick up and do further work.
So Lena, Reimann, you already made a database in a way of sites at risk and made it available. So do politicians listen to you? Are they interested in the maps you produce and say the people in Croatia and Italy, in Greece, okay, these risk sites are at risk, we have to do something?
Yeah, to a certain degree, definitely, yes. I think politicians are definitely keen to do something, but it's always, yeah, I think mainly it's a lack of awareness actually of where to look or what to do, and also what's a lack of information of what is going on. And I think the study that we did is actually a first step into this direction, into giving politicians, decision makers, something that they can work with. So the study that we did, it attracted a lot of attention, especially by the media. But also we were in contact with people from UNESCO and also from the PAPRAC, which is the Regional Activity Center that's located in Split in Croatia, which is implementing the Mediterranean Action Plan, which has the goal to promote sustainable coastal development. So we talk to people in this center as well. And I think, and this is also what we were going for, it's more this regional scale, basin-wide attention. And then based on this more local scale assessments can be done and can be initiated, and they are definitely needed to actually be able to inform policy making at the local level. I think the way it is now, and I think that's also shown in the question that was put, came up right after my talk, is how much this can be used now by policymakers. And I think it depends really on the scale. I mean, for local scale, this is not enough. We definitely need more assessments, but I think there's this awareness is definitely growing.
So I find it interesting that in Rapa Nui, there's a tendency by the local people to say, okay, this is a natural process, sea level rise, and if it takes our heritage, that's okay. That's the way the world works. So when we look at Scotland, you said, David, that there's people identify with their heritage side. So is this very different, or do you see this approach, this tendency to see it as natural way of things in Scotland as well?
Yeah, actually, so I think it depends who and where you are, who you're talking to. So Historic Environment Scotland were part of this sort of collaborative project a few years back called Learning from Loss. And as part of that project, the sort of project team visited many different cultural heritage sites all up the coast of Scotland and sat down with local community groups and tried to get their perceptions or their thoughts and feelings towards this process of loss and this process, you know, the sort of fact that you can't save everything. And depending on where you were, the conversation would go in very, very different ways. So for example, up in Orkney, in the Orkney Islands, if you were sitting there talking to people, I think because they live in quite a harsh coastal environment already, and they see the sort of day-to-day impacts of a storm passing or a sort of falling and rising tides, their view on it was that the sea will take what the sea is going to take, and this is part of a natural process. And to me, that was quite eye-opening, because in other parts of the country, if you sat down and had that exact same conversation, it would be completely different, because you could find some smaller towns or villages who have a couple of cultural heritage sites that they're really cherish, that are really, really important to them. And the idea that they might not exist in 50 or 100 years time is quite frightening. So they would be all for the sort of, the sort of hold the line, defend the site point of view. Whereas some of the coastal communities up in the islands had a very different take on it. So it's very important. It's a very important point to make. And I think it's very important that when people are making decisions about what to do, that really it is made down at that local level. I work for a national heritage organisation, so it's not for me to go into a local community and tell them what should happen to a site. I think it's very much the community should decide what's important, what's worth saving, or perhaps what they are comfortable with letting go. So that point about the Easter Island, I think that's fascinating, that they would within sort of 2-3 generations of people, they would be sort of almost willing to accept that loss. I think that's it's quite something.
So there are different. Okay, Professor Vogt.
Yeah, I just wanted to correct an impression that people on Easter Island, on Rapa Nui, are not interested. Of course, they are interested, but the population is simply split. That's a problem. What is important to know is the island itself does not produce anything. So the island is completely dependent on tourism. So they have a strong economic interest in the preservation of the monuments. They should have, but judging the present situation by the economic interest of the population, more should have happened. And in fact, the measures that have been taken to preserve the heritage, the cultural heritage, are very few. So what I want to say is there are people there that are very much interested in preserving. Others, they don't want anybody to touch the monuments. And that's a conflict, it's a social conflict in the Rapa Nui society.
Okay, now we discuss the social attitudes, but if a society says, okay, we want to do something about it, what actually can be done? So for example, when salt spray is a major problem for the Moai in Rapa Nui, is it possible to make a film, a plastic film over the statues to protect them? So what are actually solutions which are doable?
Yeah, a quick answer. It is possible, but until today, we do not know if it is a good measure, it is a feasible measure to protect these stone statues chemically. We don't know what is going to happen in 1 generation, 2 generations, how the surfaces will change, and if the surfaces of these statues will flake off. We don't know. But there are attempts, and apart from that, there are simply too many statues. There's about 1,000, and it is too expensive to preserve all of them, to consolidate all of them.
So one has to focus. So what are solutions for the Mediterranean? So the Moses project, I think it's really a special situation. The value of Venice on the one hand, and the local structure of the lagoon, which makes it possible to even think about this kind of project. So what should other places do along the coast of the Adriatic which don't have a lagoon which can be closed off from the sea? So Professor Vafeidis, do you have any other big engineering solutions for other sites as well?
I wish I did, but I'm afraid I don't. However, I need to point out that there are very interesting projects going on, and not only in terms of World Heritage, but for example, Germany now has completed a huge plan to protect the Halligen Islands, which is cultural heritage. I mean, it's heavily engineered, and I'm not sure to what extent it affects the character of the site, but the site has been protected. So there are examples around the world. I mean, there are temples that have been, or buildings that have been moved. However, I'm afraid that the solution is very location specific. And I saw a question in the audience briefly about what site managers can do to initiate these plans. Or to be informed. I think site managers are very well informed what the problems about their site are, but the solutions require research. I don't see research as the answer to everything, but this is kind of a terra incognita kind of situation where we don't know. It was very interesting to hear Professor Vogt saying that yes, we can protect, but we don't know what the impacts will be in a few, in 1 or 2 generations if we chemically protect the statues. It was the same. I think if I'm not, I might be mistaken, in Venice with the temples, you know, they were protecting them 20, 30 years ago and found in the process that things were actually being destroyed by the materials they introduced. So this is why we do need a lot of work. And I need to point out that usually we respond when a disaster has happened. And in the case of, so reactively, we react to disasters. And in the case of World Heritage, we might lose a lot, and we need proactive adaptation. Proactive adaptation requires time, and because we do not know what to do, we need to start now. I need to point out that the MOSE project that started in 2003, if I'm not mistaken, there have been discussions in Venice since the 50s, since the 1950s. I've seen like articles, I was trying to find them. Unfortunately, I couldn't find the graphs, where people were suggesting pumping water underground to raise the ground. They were suggesting some like strange bubbles over the city of Venice, you know, things that we consider crazy maybe at the moment. I grew up with people suggesting we should put a glass dome around the Acropolis to protect it from pollution. And these things, you know, sound crazy, but so did Mose 50 years ago. And this is, I'm afraid that this is the direction in which we need to go to protect World Heritage. I also agree very much with David. We need to see what the local communities have to say about their sites. And and see, you know, whether they will accept such solutions or not.
There are many of the World Heritage Sites. The value of them is not only in the monument, but in its connection with the landscape. So in Venice, the barriers are far away, so it doesn't affect the city directly. But when you think about building a huge wall around a castle, where there was no wall before, that would affect the site very much. So are there more, in a way, natural protection measures feasible? David, I think you talked about dune protection as one measure.
Yeah, that's right. So it's such an important point to make, isn't it? That, you know, these sort of heavy engineered solutions to protect sites from the impacts of climate change, quite often, or more often than not, they really are not the solution that's most appropriate. And I would also sort of question the heavy engineered approach in terms of the impact it has in terms of climate change mitigation. You know, if pouring 50 million tons of concrete to protect something is deemed worthwhile, but that has such a huge impact in terms of emissions as well to go into that. So I don't think these solutions are really the way forward unless in very extreme cases. But the more nature-based solutions, I think, have a lot of potential, solutions that have sort of multiple benefits and a lot of added value. So if you can protect a site, so for example, that the property that I showed you, Links of Notland, where I found that bone pin, to try and protect that site again, Historic Environment Scotland have undertaken a series of dune stabilisation works. So replanting marram grasses, other species of grass, to try and let that dune re-establish itself, to offer that protection, or to, you know, hold that line just for a few decades more. So there are nature-based solutions that can work, but again, it's very difficult to sort of give a blanket decision to these things, because it really will boil down to the specifics of each site. And I wanted to add something very quickly to that question about what the sort of World Heritage Site managers can do. So I don't know if people are aware, but there is this thing called the Climate Vulnerability Index, and it's a tool that is being developed. It was developed in Australia and tested on a natural World Heritage Site, but just last year we trialled it up in Orkney on our Heart of Neolithic Orkney World Heritage Site. So that was the first cultural heritage site, sort of physical cultural heritage site that it was trialled on. So it's a tool that's developing to let people understand what the key climate, what the sites are really at risk from. And it's a sort of community-based project type as well. It involves engagement with a wide range of people in order to drill down into what the sort of most severe impacts of climate change are for each site. So as a tool, that's potentially something that people would maybe want to consider to sort of increase their own awareness of it. And we'll post a link, if that's allowed, into the chat to take you to the publication, because it might be something that people want to read up on more.
Yeah, it's a good idea. Put it in the chat. Lena, Reimann, this idea of stabilizing the vulnerable sand dunes, is this a thing which we can think about in the Mediterranean as well? So in your erosion index, there's on the one hand stone, on the other hand there's sand. So is a stabilization with planting something on dunes one thing you can consider on the sites you showed up as vulnerable?
It's a good point, because I think in the Mediterranean, it's a bit more difficult to implement these measures, because there's very limited space actually around the heritage sites that we assessed. So they are located right at the coastline, often located right at the coastline. And you have, for example, historic city centers or so, which, where there's just no space to actually allow for dune development or for wetlands to use the wetlands as a protection against storm surges. So definitely it is an option if there is a lot of space available, but this depends a lot, again, on the characteristic of the site. I think it is probably not an option that's very useful in the Mediterranean context, and also in the cultural heritage context. I think maybe when it comes to natural heritage sites, it's definitely something to consider, but in the cultural heritage context in the Mediterranean, I think it's very limited.
We already talked about this very briefly, but the idea of using these World Heritage Sites, the cultural heritage site, and their endangerment by climate change as a vehicle to raise awareness of climate change and the need to adapt and to counter it. Do you think that archaeology can have an impact on climate change via this idea of protecting what is really close to people's heart? To all of you.
I can say a wee bit about that. I think it's the World Heritage Sites, you know, by their very definition, by their very nature, by the fact they are World Heritage Sites, that means they have this sort of captive audience that perhaps other cultural heritage sites or natural heritage sites, whatever they are, don't have. So truthfully, yes, they have such an important role to play, I think, in demonstrating the very best in climate action. You know, because people look to them, I think, in perhaps a different way in how they look at other cultural heritage sites. But I do get nervous when we talk about this sort of having to preserve everything in time, and it's a bit of it almost feels like a bit of a contradiction in what we do as cultural heritage professionals, because we deal in time, and these sites, they often demonstrate how they have changed over time due to various different things, and that could be historic environmental change, you know, the sort of issues of conflict in developing societies and stuff. They actually are the little time capsules of change, and climate change feels like the next big thing they have to deal with. So if the World Heritage Sites and other heritage sites in general are to deal with climate change, then I think there has to be an appreciation that they are going to have to change as well. So I think the idea that we preserve everything in time in a sort of glass box and it stays as it is, perhaps we're not doing our job right in communicating that to the public. You know, we present a sort of World Heritage Site in stasis type thing, but in actual fact, change is very much a part of what they are and who they are as sites. So I think we should try and shift that dialogue a wee bit away where we can from the idea that everything has to be protected as it is right now.
This is an interesting view, though. In a way, we have to accept maybe the loss of iconic sites because that's the way the world develops. But now I think it's a time to bring in questions of the audience, and I encourage you to ask your questions using the chat, and you can use Facebook as well. There's one question on Facebook by Gentrix Kochi. She's asking if someone can illustrate the effect of rising sea levels in modifications of the material culture of the communities living at the coastline. So does it already affect their culture? Probably this is a question for you, Lena.
I think maybe I don't know whether some of the other panelists can answer this. I find this a very difficult question, and I'm not 100% sure whether I understood it correctly. So if one of you, yeah.
Probably if it's already happening that the people at the coastline have already to adapt their culture to deal with rising sea levels, which can be more erosion, stuff like that, more floods.
I'm not an expert on the topic, so this is a kind of a social science topic I would suggest. But we do see changes in culture. I mean, people are finding new ways to live with water. They're adapting. There's a lot of research, for example, in Pacific Island nations. I've seen those beautiful pictures of classrooms where children are having a class while the class is flooded. Yes, people are adapting. They are adjusting. It's part of the adaptation. And I mean, you can see changes, for example, in architecture. You know, we have floating houses now in Northern Europe that are becoming kind of trendy and an interesting solution, for example. So we're finding new ways to live with water, which is a kind of a change in culture. However, we will see in cities this, let's call it the culture of coastal protection, dikes, because there are just too many assets at risk, and it's too expensive to find other solutions. However, there are shifts, and the question is for how long we can maintain this kind of life with water and how much sea levels will rise. And this is something that's very difficult to answer at the moment.
There's another question. What is the best way for archaeologists to help bring awareness to the issue of climate change? So this is again the idea of using iconic sites to keep the problem in the public discussion.
I really like that question because I think it taps into the power of a cultural heritage professional, be that an archaeologist or a historian or someone that works with an archive, whatever it is. We have a unique ability to tell stories, and people look to us for the sort of storytelling type experience. And as archaeologists, when you're sort of digging down into the ground or analysing different deposits or stuff, you are tracking back quite often environmental change and the very sort of archaeological deposits that you're dealing with. So there's a really unique ability, I think, because of that sort of perception of time that we have to tell stories about the future as well. So even sort of drawing out things you can learn from the past. So there's some sites where you can see rapid abandonment of them because there was some sort of really quick or rapid environmental change, so those people had to move away somewhere else to where they could live. What will the archaeological record look like for us right now in 400 or 500, 1,000 years time if we have to up sticks and rapidly abandon coastal places, etc. So in short, there's a unique ability for archaeologists to tell a story about changing environmental conditions and how people respond to that. So it's not just about the physical impacts of climate change, it's also about the social impact as well. So, and it's an untapped resource, so we must do better at talking about what we do with a sort of climate change angle on it.
Other inputs in this question of using archaeology as a rallying point?
I believe archaeologists should be more loud about their work and their findings. They're not so modest. I mean, they need to have a strong presence in the media. I mean, politics and policy are mobilized by media. And, as soon as they discover problems, be loud about it and communicate them. I also find it very important that archaeologists work together with other scientists to, in case, there are issues that can be better explored together with other specializations. So I would find it very interesting, for example, to work together closer with archaeologists when it comes to World Heritage research. I also believe there will be calls for European Union projects on World Heritage. There's a great momentum, in my opinion, at the moment during the last 2 years. And I think working together in groups of different scientists will bring a lot to the issue of World Heritage and will bring solutions, actually.
This was one of the comments of Thomas van der Linden from the audience. He said as well that the importance of the communication between different fields, heritage, conservation, engineers. So Burkhard, Vogt, David Harkin, do you see these interactions between archaeologists, social scientists, engineers in your fields as well?
Yeah, I see it. Yes, we have to. But actually, I don't know what to think about the term iconic sites. I have a problem with that. Yeah, for somebody working on Easter Island, it's a problem. When you talk about the sites on Easter Island, you always think about the giant statues, which are important and which are to some extent even unique in the Pacific. But on the other hand, there are many other monuments that have never been studied archaeologically, and there are sites without these statues, and they are as important as the others. We have to assume, or I have to assume. Let's put it that way. I simply don't know, but we need the cooperation with other sciences as well. But to be honest, at the moment, I don't know how we can approach the locals to accept other views of the matter. Of course, they are very much interested in their World Heritage status for economic reasons, as I said before. But some of them are also for academic reasons are interested in it. So I have no answer at the moment.
Well, that's an interesting point of view, Lena Reimann. So this focus on World Heritage sites, is it a risk because we forget about all the other sites, which in the Mediterranean probably number thousands of them, and the World Heritage sites are only about 50?
Yeah, this is exactly what I was also just thinking, is that, of course, World Heritage sites, they have a very special status because they are inscribed in the World Heritage List. And I also think that in these sites, it probably, as Professor Vogt said as well, as they are so important for tourism and so on, so these will be protected probably, or at least to some degree, to the degree that's possible. And I don't even know, don't have a number or anything of sites, of cultural sites that are not inscribed in the list that are affected, but also from what when I talk to people, especially in the UK and so on, I mean, there's, they also, many people or many scientists complain that it's all about like World Heritage when it comes to adaptation and so on. So, I fully agree that even if we are able to protect those roughly 40 sites that we established in the Mediterranean, there are still many other cultural heritage sites that will just be, that will not have this attention that World Heritage gets.
Well, that's a cry for more communication by archaeologists, for not only focusing on the Pantheon or the city of Venice or one big castle in Scotland or the Maui in Rapa Nui, but to show the value of smaller sites and what can be learned from them. One question from the audience is about the problem of big engineering projects like Moser, which on the one hand saves Venice, hopefully at least, but on the other, so it saves a cultural heritage, but on the other side, it might change the natural habitat of the lagoon. So we preserve the cultural side, we lose the natural side in a way. So do you see this as a problem of engineering projects everywhere, that there's, on the one hand, you try to protect culture, but you will have in a way to ransack nature?
If I may, I think this is exactly the issue that needs to be considered, like in every World Heritage site, to somehow come up with an ideal, with an adaptation strategy or measure that works to protect the site, and like in all dimensions, basically. So I mean, the Moser project is this prime example, because people have been complaining a lot that the barriers will have to be raised more and more often because of sea level rise, and then at some point the ecosystem of the lagoon will be threatened. And I think it's a very valid point, and there is always this trade-off between what are we protecting, and also what's in the end the negative consequences of it. So it's and I think this also connects to what the other panelists have said already, is that interdisciplinarity is extremely valuable in this, like at this moment, also to develop engineered solution, let's say, that are maybe but that might be like softer or not as invasive, but and to have archaeologists, engineers and so on to be working together on these solutions.
To the defense of the Moser project, I have to say that it definitely has an impact on the lagoon, but it's definitely one of the least invasive constructions, as it is not a permanent barrier. So it closes up to a couple of days, several days in the worst of cases, cannot close much longer really. And of course it has impacts on the lagoon ecosystem, but as it's not a permanent barrier, it's not very disruptive, and you cannot see it. I mean, it's lying in the bottom of the lagoon. So it is, I mean, by all means, an innovative solution compared to the large barriers that we have, for example, in the Thames River or in the Netherlands. And you know, it might not be the ultimate solution, but it is definitely a step forward.
We have a comment by Ann Jensen from Alaska. She's commenting on this idea that the World Heritage Site get too much attention, and she focuses on an interesting aspect, because in Alaska, the World Heritage Sites are either natural sites or there are settler monuments. So it's focused on the colonialists in a way and losing out on the local people. This just one comment to the discussion we already had. There are two questions dealing with problems with water and erosion, but not at the seaside, but in the land, within the land. So Cynthia Dunning-Tierstein, she is dealing with inland waters in the Alps, and there are obviously similar problems, and she hoped that solutions coming from your part can be applied there. And this relates to a question by Ferial Al-Kubati. She's from Yemen, and the old city of Sana'a, which is also affected by floods and the rain. And she asked, how can we save the heritage? Because people are living in this heritage. It's not a separate structure, but people are living in the heritage. So how can we deal with these changes when it's not a monument, but a living city, which is a monument? Yeah.
I can make a few comments on that. There was one point that you said about, you know, the sort of focusing in on World Heritage Sites and how that can sometimes be unhelpful. And I think I would support that statement, particularly in Scotland, where, you know, we have 6 World Heritage Sites, but we have hundreds of thousands of other designated assets that we know about, and then even more assets that haven't yet been found or uncovered. You know, so I do think sometimes it's good not to get sort of tied up in knots about World Heritage Sites specifically, despite the fact that they are important, of course. I think it's also worth mentioning that I live in a World Heritage City. You know, Edinburgh Old and New Towns is inscribed on the list as well, and I'm right on the boundary of it. So if I look out my window, I'm about 5 minutes away from the boundary of the city. So I am in that city every single day, walking about, living my life over here in Edinburgh. And so that point about how these are living cities, and, you know, you can't just chuck people out, that it's so important. And it just comes back to that point about, you know, we can't treat these places sort of frozen in time. They have to evolve and adapt to the new challenges that are around us, and particularly around climate change and all the new stuff that sort of presents us. So I agree wholeheartedly with that. You know, there has to be some sort of a little bit of movement in here so that these places can still be livable cities. So, and I say that as someone that pretty much lives in one of those World Heritage Sites, so perhaps I have a vested interest. But that would be my take on it.
Another view on this?
Yeah, if I may. I think, the examples that we've been talking about already, that also Nassos mentioned with the Halligan Islands, for example, there are just a few people living on those, but there are also these solutions that include that people will remain in those areas, and the same actually goes for Venice. So there's also the solution to keep Venice livable, basically. So I think there are solutions that can be that we can find for those situations, but there is just, I think, not a lot of research on this at the moment.
So there's another question about the issue of Venice from Ferran Antolin, and the question is to be a bit provocative. Is the Venice system truly aiming to protect culture, heritage, or business? Should protection measures take business into account to be more successful? Or do we only react when bigger issues are at risk? So this refers in a bit to the Rapa Nui situation as well, where it could be a business proposal to protect these sites. So do we see that the economic value is an important consideration in which sites to protect?
I mean, absolutely. The decisions are always made on some kind of cost-benefit basis. And, you know, you protect Venice. I mean, Venice is a living city, you know? So if you want Venice to remain a living city, you have to protect it. And of course, business is also considered. However, the case of Venice is a little bit more complex, I think, also because the Mose was kind of promised, if I'm not mistaken, during elections by Berlusconi, which gave him quite a few votes back then, and it was actually realized. So, you know, it is complex. I mean, sure, but we want to protect business. We also want to protect heritage. I like very much the questions about the US and, you know, the fact that many sites are natural or white settlers monuments. And it comes back to what everyone was saying before. There are so many sites. However, we do need to start from somewhere. And I don't know if this is a good thing or a bad thing. The World Heritage sites, the UNESCO World Heritage sites are the ones that do receive most attention. And, you know, solutions that are implemented there can be transferred to other situations, possibly, potentially.
So is the business approach, Professor Vogt, an argument which people in Rapa Nui listen to say, okay, you lose your tourism industry if you don't protect your sites?
Well, at least part of the population, the major part of the population will listen to it. But still there is a minority that is opposed to any intervention, heritage intervention. So I simply cannot answer the question. The population is very small. There are 5,000 people, and there's a high number of tourists, about 100,000 tourists coming each year. Yeah, and almost everybody depends on tourism. Yeah, so theoretically, everybody should be interested. Yeah, so what is going to happen if they are not investing into the safeguard of the monuments? I cannot answer. They are discussing themselves, and sooner or later they have to come they have to make up their minds. But at the moment, I think they are just in the discussion. We have to wait. I cannot tell you.
Okay, so I don't see any questions in the audience. So if there are any questions, now is the time to ask them. Type away. I will come back to them. But to sum up the discussion, so we have the risk of climate change, sea level rise, salt spray, tsunamis, erosion. All of this will affect all these sites at the coast or boundaries in the water inland. And to protect them, one message from the panel seems to be that it's essential to engage with the local community, because without their help, you can't hope to protect the sites. And the other important message seems to be we have to start now to even have a chance to do something about it. And starting now seems to involve, for the archaeologists, to speak about which sites or learn about which sites are really at risk, and to engage with their community, engage with engineers. So are there final comments you want to make while we wait for the audience to throw the last questions at us?
I would just like to sort of back up that point that's been made now a couple of times about the need for people to work together. You need to sort of all different walks of life sitting around the decision-making table when it comes to stuff like this, because it's really not a decision for any one person or any one sort of subsect of society to make. It really requires a sort of breadth of different voices, I think, to make sure that the decisions we make are the right ones, because as we know, and as is demonstrated many times, particularly when you're dealing with a new challenge like climate change, there can be a lot of unintended consequences over the actions that we do choose to take. So we just have to make sure that when we do decide to do something, it's based really on the sort of judgment of a sort of cohort of people all working together.
Okay, so I'll thank the audience for listening into this lively discussion on the impact of climate change on historic sites at the coastline, rising sea levels, other problems. We've learned the solutions are really difficult and they take a long time to implement, so we have to start as soon as possible. And we talked about the impact of sea level rise, but this is a consequence of the main element of climate change, which is rising temperatures. And this is a topic of our next session, which will involve historic sites in quite different environments, in glaciers, in the permafrost, far in the north. So the subject of discussion number 5 will be impact of climate change and cultural heritage, warming. It will be in a week from now on the 21st of October, again at 6 p.m. And I hope that many of you will listen in. And for the moment, I thank all of the panelists for their insightful presentations and discussion, and to the audience that you were willing to ask questions and to listen in. So have a nice evening and hopefully see you next week. Goodbye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.